Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. We're going to examine a disturbing possibility, not as entertainment, but as serious philosophical inquiry. The question isn't whether cosmic horror is real in some supernatural sense. That misses the point entirely. The question is whether cosmic horror, as articulated by H.P. Lovecraft and developed across a century of subsequent literature, provides a more accurate framework for understanding our universe than the comforting narratives we've constructed to shield ourselves from existential truth. This requires us to look carefully at what Lovecraft actually argued. He wasn't writing fantasy. He was a philosophical materialist who rejected all supernatural claims, who corresponded with contemporary scientists, who read voraciously in astronomy and geology. His stories functioned as thought experiments. What if we took scientific cosmology seriously and followed its implications to their logical conclusion? What if the universe revealed by physics, biology, and astronomy is precisely as indifferent and incomprehensible as his fiction suggests? We'll trace cosmic horror from its philosophical origins through its literary manifestations to its unsettling resonance with actual scientific discoveries. We'll examine specific texts as evidence, not entertainment, and we'll consider why this framework, universe as blind mechanism, humanity as cosmic accident, consciousness as temporary glitch, feels more credible now than when Lovecraft first articulated it. By the end, you may find these ideas difficult to dismiss. That's not a failure of logic. That's the point. Howard Phillips Lovecraft died in 1937, impoverished and largely unknown outside pulp fiction circles. He never intended to create a mythology. He certainly never imagined his work would be analyzed in philosophy departments or cited in discussions of extinction-level risks. What he did intend, and stated explicitly in his voluminous correspondence, was to articulate a specific philosophical position through fictional means. He called it cosmicism, and it represented a systematic rejection of every comforting assumption Western civilization had constructed about humanity's place in the universe. The historical moment matters considerably. Lovecraft wrote during the interwar period, when certainties were collapsing across multiple domains simultaneously. Einstein's theories of relativity had demolished Newtonian absolutes between 1905 and 1915. Astronomers were discovering that our galaxy was merely one among billions, expanding the known universe by factors of magnitude every few years. Freud had revealed consciousness itself as unreliable narrator of its own operations. These weren't abstract academic developments. They were existential dislocations, and Lovecraft absorbed them all. Consider what he wrote to Farnsworth Wright in 1927. All my tales are based on the fundamental premise that common human laws and interests and emotions have no validity or significance in the vast cosmos at large. This wasn't rhetorical flourish, it was philosophical commitment. Lovecraft had abandoned religious faith by age 5, embraced mechanistic materialism by adolescence, and spent his adult life working out the implications. If the universe operates according to blind physical law, if consciousness is merely matter, achieving temporary self-organization, if Earth represents an infinitesimal fraction of cosmic space and time, then human concerns, our morality, our meanings, our desperate search for purpose, are literally insignificant. What distinguishes Lovecraft from earlier writers of supernatural horror is this systematic application of scientific worldview to horror fiction. Gothic literature preserved moral architecture. Ghosts returned for justice. Vampires represented corrupted souls. Evil could be confronted and defeated. Lovecraft eliminated all that His entities aren't evil. They're indifferent. They don't violate natural law. They reveal that natural law is far stranger and more hostile to human flourishing than we'd imagined. The horror isn't supernatural intervention in an orderly world. The horror is discovering that the world was never orderly to begin with. He articulated this most clearly in his 1921 essay, A Confession of Unfaith, written for an amateur journalism publication. There he dismissed all religious consolation as wishful thinking and declared that humanity must confront the crushing futility of existence, not as teenagers being edgy, but as adults accepting evidence. The universe demonstrated through astronomy, geology, and evolutionary biology was genuinely indifferent to human survival. Our extinction would register cosmically as nothing more significant than the cooling of a minor star. This philosophical commitment explains his famous opening to The Call of Cthulhu, written in 1926. The Yale, most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. Mercy, not cruelty. Ignorance as protection. Because full comprehension of our cosmic situation, our belatedness, our insignificance, our inevitable annihilation, would make continued existence psychologically untenable. The stories that follow this premise aren't entertainment. They're philosophical thought experiments about what happens when that merciful ignorance fails. Lovecraft's goal, then, was neither to create mythology nor to entertain readers seeking escapist thrills. He aimed to convey what he perceived as existential truth through the only medium capable of making abstract cosmology viscerally comprehensible: horror fiction. The tentacles and incantations were narrative vehicles. The actual horror was the philosophy underneath, and that philosophy was simply scientific materialism followed to its endpoint without comforting evasions. This raises an immediate question. What were the specific intellectual traditions that shaped this worldview? Lovecraft didn't invent cosmic pessimism. He synthesized it from sources both ancient and contemporary. Lovecraft's cosmicism didn't emerge from nowhere. It represented the convergence of multiple intellectual traditions, some centuries old, others barely decades established when he began writing. Understanding these antecedents reveals cosmic horror not as imaginative invention, but as synthesis, the application of existing philosophical frameworks to narrative form. The most direct influence was Arthur Schopenhauer, whose The World as Will and Representation, 1818, proposed that beneath apparent reality lay a blind, purposeless force he termed will. Not conscious desire, but mindless striving, existence without reason or goal. Schopenhauer's universe contained no divine providence, no moral arc, no teleological purpose. It simply was, grinding forward through endless cycles of suffering and temporary cessation. Lovecraft encountered Schopenhauer in his early 20s and recognized immediate affinity. Here was philosophical validation for his intuitive rejection of anthropocentrism. If Schopenhauer was correct, then human consciousness represented a cruel cosmic joke, awareness sufficient to recognize meaninglessness, but insufficient to escape it. Friedrich Nietzsche extended this framework through his declaration of God's death. Writing in the 1880s, Nietzsche didn't merely claim God didn't exist. He announced that the cultural construction of God had collapsed, leaving a void that would consume all meaning derived from that construction. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? He asked in The Gay Science. Lovecraft absorbed this problem without accepting Nietzsche's proposed solution of self-created values. Instead, he embraced the void itself. If God was dead, if no transcendent meaning existed, then humanity floated in genuine cosmic darkness with nothing but its own invented stories for light. Literary precedent existed as well. Thomas Hardy's novels, particularly Jude the Obscure, 1895, and The Return of the Native, 1878, portrayed human lives crushed by indifferent cosmic forces operating through impersonal causation. Hardy's universe didn't actively punish characters. It simply failed to care whether they suffered or flourished. Lovecraft recognized this as aesthetically sophisticated materialism, tragedy without divine orchestration. Hardy's cosmic pessimism proved that literature could convey philosophical positions as effectively as academic philosophy, perhaps more effectively, since narrative bypassed intellectual resistance. The scientific developments of Lovecraft's era provided empirical foundation for these philosophical positions. Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, 1859, had eliminated teleological purpose from biology. Species weren't designed for specific ends. They were accidents of environmental pressure and random mutation, survivors only until conditions changed. Humanity represented one outcome among millions of evolutionary experiments, no more cosmically significant than trilobites or stromatolites. Darwin's theory didn't merely challenge religious creation narratives. It demolished the entire concept of purposeful existence. Cosmology delivered even more devastating revelations. Throughout the 1920s, Edwin Hubble's observations proved that our galaxy was one among countless others, that the universe was expanding, that cosmic scale exceeded anything previously imagined. What had been the universe, our Milky Way, became a single minor structure in incomprehensible vastness. Lovecraft followed these discoveries closely, incorporating them into stories. At the Mountains of Madness references Antarctic exploration, concurrent with its composition. The Color Out of Space invokes spectroscopy discoveries. He weaponized contemporary science for philosophical horror. Thermodynamics contributed its own form of dread. Lord Kelvin's predictions of heat death, the second law of thermodynamics guaranteeing universal entropy, meant that cosmic history had a trajectory, and that trajectory ended in maximum disorder. All complexity, all life, all consciousness represented temporary violations of the universe's natural tendency toward homogeneous equilibrium. Lovecraft's Azathoth, the blind idiot god at the center of existence, functioned as literary personification of entropy itself, purposeless chaos toward which all order inevitably collapsed. Pre-Socratic atomism provided ancient precedent. Democritus and Leucippus proposed in the 5th century BCE that reality consisted entirely of atoms colliding in void according to mechanical necessity. No gods, no purposes, no meanings, just particles and empty space operating according to impersonal law. Lovecraft studied classical philosophy and recognized these ancient materialists as intellectual ancestors. 23 centuries before modern physics confirmed atomic theory, Greek philosophers had proposed a universe fundamentally hostile to human significance. Edgar Allan Poe deserves particular attention. His cosmological prose poem, Eureka, 1848, proposed that the universe began from divine unity, fragmented into matter, and would eventually collapse back into unity through gravitational attraction. Lovecraft considered Eureka prophetic, a 19th century anticipation of Big Bang cosmology and eventual cosmic collapse. Poe's willingness to present speculative cosmology as serious philosophy, to blend science and imagination without clear demarcation, directly influenced Lovecraft's narrative approach. Finally, the concept of the sublime, articulated by Edmund Burke in 1757 and refined by Immanuel Kant in 1790, provided aesthetic framework. The sublime designated experiences that overwhelmed rational comprehension, vast distances, incomprehensible scales, forces beyond human control. Burke and Kant treated the sublime as producing mixed terror and awe. Lovecraft stripped away the awe, retaining only terror. His cosmic entities and incomprehensible geometries weren't meant to inspire transcendent wonder. They demonstrated the limits of human cognition, confronting realities our neurology never evolved to process. These weren't casual influences. Lovecraft systematically synthesized philosophical pessimism, scientific materialism, literary naturalism, and aesthetic theory into a coherent worldview, then deployed fiction as its delivery mechanism. The question becomes, how did he encode these abstract concepts into narrative language that could convey philosophical positions through visceral experience? Lovecraft understood that language itself could function as philosophical weapon. The terminology he deployed invented words, archaic constructions, deliberate unpronounceability, wasn't decorative flourish. It served specific, epistemological purposes, encoding cosmic horror's central premise, that reality exceeds human capacity for comprehension and articulation. Consider the distinction between cosmic and cosmicism. The former simply designates scale, pertaining to the cosmos, the universe at large. The latter represents a philosophical position, coined posthumously to describe Lovecraft's worldview, but implicit in his work. Cosmicism argues that the cosmos operates according to principles fundamentally indifferent to human existence, that our presence represents accident rather than intention, that cosmic scale renders human concerns literally meaningless. This isn't nihilism in the traditional sense. Nihilism typically mourns the absence of meaning. Cosmicism observes that meaning was never present to begin with, that expecting cosmic significance represents anthropocentric delusion. The linguistic shift from adjective to philosophical stance encodes the entire theoretical framework. The names of Lovecraft's entities perform even more complex functions. Cthulhu, Nyarlathotep, Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth. These resist comfortable pronunciation. Try saying Cthulhu aloud without referencing written guides. The initial consonant cluster violates English phonotactics. Lovecraft explicitly described it as approximation. The first syllable pronounced gutturally and very thickly. The U is about like that in full, and the first syllable is not unlike klul in sound. Not a name, but an attempt at a name, a phonetic gesture towards something human vocal apparatus cannot properly articulate. This unpronounceability serves deliberate purpose. Language evolved to categorize human-scale phenomena, to facilitate communication about objects and experiences relevant to survival and social coordination. When encountering entities that predate human existence, that operate according to non-human logic, human language fails. The struggle to pronounce these names enacts the larger struggle to comprehend the entities themselves. Pronunciation difficulty becomes epistemological barrier rendered physical. You cannot say the name correctly because human neurology and physiology never developed mechanisms for processing what the name designates. Lovecraft's invented texts operate through similar principles. The Necronomicon, supposedly authored by the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred in Damascus circa 730 CE, represents forbidden knowledge made textual. Its very title combines Greek and Latin roots awkwardly. Necros, dead, nomos, law, yielding something like Book of Dead Names, or Laws Concerning the Dead. though Lovecraft himself admitted to inventing the title from whole cloth during a dream. The Pennacotic manuscripts, the Book of Ibon, De Vermis Mysteries, Mysteries of the Worm, each functions as epistemological marker, a source of information that transforms its readers. These texts serve multiple narrative purposes simultaneously. They establish verisimilitude through specificity, not an ancient book, but the Necronomicon, Olaus Wormius Latin translation, 1228. They create intertextual consistency across stories, as different characters reference the same sources. They position Lovecraft's fiction within a tradition of occult literature, stretching back to actual grimoires like The Lesser Key of Solomon or Picatrix. Most crucially, they embody the concept of infohazard, information that damages through comprehension. Reading the Necronomicon doesn't provide power. It provides knowledge that destroys the reader's capacity for normal existence. Mathematical and geometric terminology carries similar weight. Non-Euclidean geometry appears throughout Lovecraft's work, describing architecture that violates intuitive spatial relationships. This wasn't casual appropriation of technical language. Non-Euclidean geometries, hyperbolic and elliptic geometries developed in the 19th century, demonstrated that Euclid's axioms represented one possible spatial framework among many. Space itself could be curved. Angles in triangles could sum to more or less than 180 degrees. Parallel lines might converge or diverge. For Lovecraft, this mathematical revolution proved that human intuitions about basic reality were provincial, adapted to local conditions, but cosmically invalid. When he described Arlier's architecture as wrong or composed of impossible angles, he wasn't being vague. He invoked geometries human perception evolved to reject. Our neurology processes three-dimensional Euclidean space efficiently because that's what we navigate daily. Structures built according to different geometric principles would register as cognitively disturbing, would produce the sensation of wrongness without identifiable cause. The geometry itself becomes hostile to human consciousness. Terms like cyclopean, blasphemous, eldritch, and aeon function through historical and connotative depth. Cyclopean designates architecture of massive, irregular stone blocks, originally attributed to the mythical Cyclopes in ancient Greece. Lovecraft applied it to pre-human ruins, suggesting construction by beings of comparable alterity and power. Blasphemous imports religious terminology into materialist horror. These geometries and entities blaspheme not against God, whom Lovecraft rejected, but against human-scaled reality itself. Eldritch derives from Middle English, meaning weird or ghostly, carrying archaic weight that distances the reader from contemporary comfort. Aeon designates cosmic timescales, geological and astronomical durations that dwarf human history. The strategic deployment of archaic language, wherein heretofore, eldritch, antediluvian, creates temporal distance. It positions the narrator as scholar examining ancient records, translator of fragmentary accounts, inheritor of suppressed traditions. This faux scholarly voice grants authority, while suggesting that the events described occurred long ago or exist at remove from ordinary experience. The reader becomes not observer of current events, but examiner of historical evidence, already positioned in retrospective analytical mode. Scientific terminology, weaponized for horror purposes, represents perhaps the most sophisticated linguistic strategy. Protoplasm, phosphorescence, spectrum, refraction. Lovecraft imported precise technical language into horror context. lending scientific credibility while rendering the familiar alien. When the color out of space describes a meteorite containing strange organic properties that resist spectroscopic analysis, it invokes actual scientific methodology while suggesting that methodology's inadequacy. The color exists outside the visible spectrum, beyond human perceptual capacity, a phenomenon literally beyond our ability to experience directly. This linguistic architecture accomplishes something remarkable. It encodes the philosophical position that reality exceeds human comprehension into the very language used to describe that reality. The readers struggle with pronunciation, the unsettling effect of geometric terminology, the authority of archaic constructions, the inadequacy of scientific language, all enact the central cosmic horror premise. We are confronting something our cognitive and linguistic tools never evolved to process. The question that follows naturally: how did Lovecraft and his collaborators build these linguistic elements into a coherent fictional mythology that readers would treat as potentially real? The term Cthulhu mythos never appeared in Lovecraft's lifetime. August Derleth coined it in 1939, 2 years after Lovecraft's death, attempting to systematize what Lovecraft himself approached more organically. This distinction matters considerably. Lovecraft wasn't constructing a mythology in the way Tolkien built Middle-earth. No comprehensive cosmology, no complete genealogies, no systematic theology. Instead, he created the impression of a mythology, fragments glimpsed through damaged texts and unreliable accounts, deliberately incomplete because completeness would imply human comprehension of the incomprehensible. The technique of faux scholarship provided the primary mechanism for this effect. When The Call of Cthulhu opens with Francis Wayland Thurston examining his deceased granduncle's papers, we enter a nested structure of documentation. Thurston reading Professor Angel's notes about Inspector Legrasse's report of New Orleans cult activities, cross-referenced with sculptor Henry Wilcox's dream journals and Norwegian sailor Gustaf Johansson's manuscript. Each layer adds verisimilitude through specificity. These aren't anonymous sources. They're named individuals with credentials, geographic locations, documented professions. The footnote quality. See Angel's notes on the Cthulhu Cult supplementary section, dated March 23, 1925. Mimics academic citation practice. Positioning. The reader as researcher rather than fiction consumer. Geographic specificity amplified this authentication effect. Lovecraft's New England wasn't generic Gothic landscape. It was Arkham, Massachusetts, with Miskatonic University founded 1690, located northwest of Boston at specific, though fictional, coordinates. The university possessed a library including the rare D translation of the Necronomicon, acquired 1862. Innsmouth occupied a precise location on the Massachusetts coast, accessible by specific bus routes that stopped running after particular incidents in 1927-1928. When At the Mountains of Madness provided Antarctic coordinates for the Elder Thing city, approximately 76°15 Fon, 113°10 E, readers could theoretically verify the location on maps, finding genuine Antarctic geography that Lovecraft incorporated into his fictional excavation. This technique extended to temporal precision. Events occurred on specific dates with documented consequences. The 1925 earthquake that coincided with Cthulhu's stirring affected recorded seismographic data worldwide. The Innsmouth raid took place February 1928, conducted by federal authorities for reasons officially suppressed. The Miskatonic Antarctic expedition departed September 2, 1930, returned March 1931, with detailed daily logs, despite subsequent institutional suppression. These timestamps created the impression of events that actually occurred, documented in records accessible to the determined researcher. Collaborative world-building intensified the authentication effect exponentially. Lovecraft maintained extensive correspondence with fellow pulp writers, Robert E. Howard, Clark Ashton Smith, Robert Bloch, Frank Belknap Long, others. He encouraged them to reference his invented elements in their own stories, while he reciprocally incorporated theirs. Howard's Unaussprechlichen Kulten, Nameless Cults, by Friedrich Wilhelm von Junst, appeared in Lovecraft's work. Smith's Book of Eibon and Planet Yugoth crossed authorial boundaries. Bloch set stories in Lovecraft's Arkham, while Lovecraft referenced Bloch's invented grimoires. This cross-pollination created a textual network that exceeded any single author's invention. When multiple writers independently reference the same forbidden texts, the same entity names, the same geographic locations, readers encounter what appears to be shared source material rather than coordinated fiction. The effect resembles conspiracy theorists encountering the same evidence across multiple websites. The repetition itself becomes validation, even when the original source is fabricated. By 1930, a reader could encounter references to the Necronomicon in stories by 5 different authors across 3 different pulp magazines, never seeing direct collaboration acknowledged. Lovecraft's personal correspondence reinforced this blurring of fiction and reference. He wrote to friends in character, discussing the Necronomicon as if it existed, debating the precise spelling of Cthulhu, comparing notes on the appearance of various entities. August Derleth preserved and published these letters, which readers then encountered as primary source material. Where did the fiction end and genuine occult belief begin? The question itself became impossible to answer definitively, especially for readers encountering the material decades later without access to Lovecraft's private clarifications. The deliberate incompleteness served crucial function. Lovecraft rarely provided complete explanations. The Call of Cthulhu never explains Cthulhu's origin, purpose, or ultimate capabilities, only that it waits in R'lyeh, that it influences dreams, that when the stars are right, it will rise. What are the right stellar configurations? How does psychic influence operate? What happens after Cthulhu rises? These questions remain unanswered because Lovecraft's narrators, human investigators with limited information, cannot answer them. The fragmentary nature mirrors actual historical knowledge. We possess partial texts, conflicting accounts, suppressed records, not omniscient overview. This approach differed fundamentally from fantasy world-building contemporary to Lovecraft's era. Lord Dunsany created fully realized fantasy realms with their own logic and completion. E.R. Edison's The Worm, Ouroboros, 1922, presented a secondary world with consistent internal rules. These fantasy writers invited readers into alternate realities. Lovecraft instead suggested that this reality contained layers most people never perceived, that the world we inhabit has always contained cosmic horror existing just beyond typical perception. The difference is between escapism and revelation. Fantasy offers somewhere else to go. Cosmic horror insists there's nowhere to escape. The recursive quality of later editions complicated authentication further. Writers in the 1940s and beyond treated Lovecraft's stories as source material, extracting elements and expanding them. Derleth systematized the mythos into opposed forces: elder gods versus great old ones, cosmic good fighting, cosmic evil. This directly contradicted Lovecraft's philosophical position that the cosmos contains no moral dimension, but it proliferated nonetheless. Colin Wilson's novels treated the Cthulhu mythos as genuine occult system requiring serious esoteric study. Each iteration added layers, making original intent harder to discern. The cultural result. By the 1960s, people genuinely believed the Necronomicon might exist. Libraries reported inquiries. Occult bookstores received requests. The Miskatonic University Library appeared in bibliographies. Hoax editions of the Necronomicon began circulating, most notoriously the Simon Necronomicon, 1977, which combined Lovecraftian elements with Sumerian mythology into something presented as authentic grimoire. The fiction had achieved what Lovecraft perhaps never intended, but certainly enabled. It became folklore, with all the ambiguity folklore entails about historical versus fictional origins. This myth-building strategy succeeded because it exploited fundamental features of how humans process information. We evolved to detect patterns, to trust multiple sources over single sources, to accept documented specificity as evidence of truth. Lovecraft's faux scholarship, geographic precision, cross-author validation, and deliberate incompleteness all triggered these cognitive heuristics. The result wasn't just entertaining fiction. It was fiction that occupied the same psychological space as suppressed history, creating persistent uncertainty about ontological status. What philosophical concepts did this elaborate authentication mechanism serve to convey? What core ideas required such careful narrative scaffolding? We turn now to the substance beneath the technique. The philosophical substrate of cosmic horror rests on three interlocking propositions, each independently disturbing, collectively devastating. First, humanity occupies no special position in cosmic architecture. Second, the universe trends inexorably toward maximum entropy and dissolution. Third, consciousness itself may be a localized phenomenon within larger dreaming systems, our perceived reality merely one layer of nested unrealities. These aren't supernatural claims. They're extensions of accepted scientific principles followed to conclusions we typically avoid confronting. Cosmic insignificance functions as foundational premise. The observable universe spans approximately 93 billion light-years in diameter, containing an estimated 2 trillion galaxies. Our galaxy, the Milky Way, contains 100 to 400 billion stars. Earth orbits an unremarkable yellow dwarf in the galaxy's outer spiral arm, one planet among trillions. Temporally, the situation worsens. The universe has existed for 13.8 billion years. Earth formed 4.5 billion years ago. Anatomically modern humans emerged roughly 300,000 years ago. Our entire species represents 0.002% of Earth's history, which itself represents 33% of cosmic history. We are late arrivals to an ancient process that will continue long after our extinction. Lovecraft articulated this mathematically grounded horror in The Call of Cthulhu. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The island metaphor captures our situation precisely. We occupy a small, stable region, Earth's biosphere, familiar physics, comprehensible scales, surrounded by vast incomprehensibility. The Copernican principle, which removed Earth from cosmic center, represents merely the first demotion. Subsequent discoveries revealed our galaxy as non-central, our stellar neighborhood as utterly typical, our very atoms as constituting only 5% of the universe's mass energy, the rest being dark matter and dark energy whose nature remains unknown. Every measurement increases our insignificance. Consider the practical implications. The Andromeda Galaxy contains approximately 1 trillion stars, supports presumably billions of planets, and will collide with our galaxy in roughly 4.5 billion years. This collision will fundamentally restructure both galaxies, likely ejecting our solar system into intergalactic space. Whether humanity still exists at that point is cosmically irrelevant. The process will proceed according to gravitational mechanics regardless. Our extinction would register to the universe as nothing more significant than a minor fluctuation in one solar system's chemical composition. This isn't pessimism, it's arithmetic applied to astronomical observation. Entropic inevitability provides the temporal dimension to spatial insignificance. The second law of thermodynamics states that closed systems trend toward maximum entropy, disorder, equilibrium, heat death. The universe constitutes a closed system on the largest scale. All current complexity, all structure, all life represents temporary violation of this trend, borrowing order from increasing disorder elsewhere. Eventually, perhaps 100 years from now, the universe reaches maximum entropy. Uniform temperature distribution, no energy gradients, no possibility of work being performed or complexity emerging. Stars burn out, black holes evaporate via Hawking radiation. Even protons may decay, leaving only photons and leptons in perfect thermal equilibrium. Lovecraft's Azathoth, the blind idiot god at the center of infinity, bubbling and blasphemous, gnawed by nameless things and ultimate void, functions as literary personification of this entropic principle. Not intelligent, not purposeful, simply the fundamental chaos toward which all order collapses. The entity exists outside time, meaning it represents the final state toward which time's arrow points. Cosmologists call this heat death. Lovecraft called it Azathoth. The difference is primarily nomenclature. Both describe the same inevitable endpoint: maximum disorder, the cessation of all possibility, eternal stasis in which nothing can happen because all energy gradients have been exhausted. The dream hypothesis introduces even more disturbing implications. What if consciousness, all perceived reality, represents merely localized awareness within larger dreaming systems? Lovecraft explored this extensively in his Dreamland stories, but the concept extends beyond fantasy into genuine philosophical problem. We experience reality through sensory data processed by neural systems that evolved for survival, not truth. The color red doesn't exist in electromagnetic radiation. It's a neural interpretation. Time's passage feels real, but physics suggests it may be emergent property rather than fundamental feature. The self feels unified, but neuroscience reveals it as constructed narrative, integrating multiple subsystems. How much of experienced reality reflects actual external structure versus imposed interpretation? Quantum mechanics contributes unsettling support for this position. The observer effect demonstrates that measurement affects quantum systems. Particles exist in superposition until observed, at which point they collapse to definite states. Multiple interpretations exist: Copenhagen, many worlds, pilot wave, but all involve consciousness or observation playing unexpected roles in physical reality. If observation affects quantum behavior, and quantum behavior underlies all physical processes, then consciousness isn't passive receiver of external reality, but active participant in its manifestation. This doesn't prove we're dreaming. It demonstrates that the relationship between consciousness and reality is far stranger than common sense suggests. Lovecraft's The Silver Key and through the gates of the Silver Key, explore these implications through Randolph Carter's discovery that multiple versions of himself exist across different levels of reality, that his human existence represents one temporary manifestation of a larger entity existing beyond space and time. The horror isn't monsters attacking. The horror is discovering that selfhood, temporal continuity, and material reality itself may be provisional, localized, subject to dissolution upon broader awakening. If we're thoughts in some cosmic dreamer's mind, our extinction becomes not death, but the dreamer's casual shift of attention. These three concepts, spatial insignificance, temporal entropy, ontological uncertainty, comprise cosmic horror's philosophical core. They require no supernatural intervention. They emerge from extending accepted scientific frameworks to their logical conclusions without comforting evasions. What entities or forces embody these principles in Lovecraft's fiction? Lovecraft's entities divide into categories reflecting different aspects of cosmic horror's philosophical structure. The outer gods represent fundamental forces or principles, not beings in any biological sense, but aspects of reality itself. The Great Old Ones occupy an intermediary position, physically instantiated, immensely powerful, yet ultimately subject to cosmic law. The distinction matters. Outer gods cannot be fought or negotiated with because they constitute the conditions of existence itself. Great Old Ones can theoretically be resisted, though resistance proves inevitably futile given the scale differential involved. Azathoth occupies cosmic center in Lovecraft's cosmology, described as the nuclear chaos beyond angled space and the boundless demon sultan. Not a deity in any religious sense, no consciousness, no intention, no response to prayer or supplication. Instead, Azathoth represents primordial chaos, the default state from which order temporarily emerges and to which it inevitably returns. The entity bubbles and blasphemes at existence's center, surrounded by flopping horde of mindless and amorphous dancers, and lulled by the thin, monotonous piping of a demonic flute. This image encodes entropy's inevitability. All complexity eventually dissolves into undifferentiated chaos. All structure collapses into maximum disorder. Azathoth doesn't threaten to destroy reality. Azathoth is what reality becomes when all temporary order has dissipated. The nuclear chaos descriptor carries additional significance given Lovecraft's writing period. He composed most Azathoth references during the 1920s and 1930s, as quantum mechanics was revealing the atom structure. Electrons orbiting nuclei in probabilistic clouds, nuclear forces binding protons and neutrons through mechanisms then barely understood, the possibility of nuclear fission lurking in theoretical physics. Nuclear chaos anticipates the discovery that matter's foundation involves violent, barely constrained forces operating according to statistical rather than deterministic principles. The atom itself contains a miniature Azathoth, probability and force rather than solid substance. Yog-Sothoth represents space-time itself achieving something approaching consciousness, described as the gate and the key, and existing conterminous with all time and space. Where Azathoth embodies entropy, Yog-Sothoth embodies the four-dimensional manifold in which events occur. Lovecraft's description, all was known to Yog-Sothoth, follows logically if the entity is space-time. Every point in space, every moment in time exists within Yog-Sothoth's structure. Past, present, future are simultaneously accessible because they're all regions of the same four-dimensional continuum. Human temporal experience, our sensation of moving through time, represents localized perspective within a larger static structure that Yog-Sothoth encompasses totally. This connects disturbingly to modern physics. Einstein's special relativity demonstrates that simultaneity is relative. Events simultaneous in one reference frame occur sequentially in another. General relativity describes spacetime as geometric structure curved by mass energy. Block universe theory proposes that past, present, and future exist equally, with temporal passage being illusion created by consciousness moving through static, four-dimensional structure. If block universe theory is correct, then something like Yog-Sothoth, entity or principle existing across all time simultaneously, becomes less metaphorical horror and more accurate description of spacetime's actual nature. Nyarlathotep occupies unique position as the crawling chaos, mobile and actively interfering where other outer gods remain static or distant. Lovecraft depicted Nyarlathotep with multiple avatars: the Black Pharaoh, the Haunter of the Dark, the Bloody Tongue, suggesting not a single entity, but a category of manifestation, information made toxic and mobile. Where Azathoth represents entropy and Yog-Sothoth represents space-time, Nyarlathotep represents corrupting knowledge itself, the messenger carrying news that destroys recipients. The entity doesn't kill through physical force, but through revelation, showing humans truths that shatter their capacity for continued functioning. This anticipates modern concepts of infohazards and basilisk problems in philosophy and computer science. An infohazard is information dangerous merely through being known. Nuclear weapon designs, biological weapon formulas, certain ontological arguments that might trap consciousness in logical loops. Nyarlathotep literalizes this. The messenger whose message is poison, knowledge that functions as weapon. In Nyarlathotep, 1920, the entity demonstrates scientific instruments revealing the hellish truth, while crowds descend into madness. The content of revelation isn't specified because the horror is revelation itself, the collapse of protective ignorance. The great old ones function differently, being physically embodied rather than abstract principles given form. Cthulhu represents the most extensively developed example. Priest, or leader of the old ones, entombed in Relia beneath the Pacific, waiting for stellar alignment that permits its emergence. The famous formulation, "That is not dead, which can eternal lie," and with strange aeons, even death may die, encodes a disturbing possibility about consciousness and existence. What if death isn't binary state, but continuum? What if sufficiently alien biology permits suspension between existence and non-existence, waiting for conditions permitting reactivation? This isn't pure fantasy. Tardigrades survive extreme conditions through cryptobiosis, essentially suspending all metabolic activity until favorable conditions return. Bacterial spores remain viable for millions of years. Certain nematodes frozen in Siberian permafrost for 40,000 years have been successfully revived. If terrestrial organisms can achieve such prolonged suspension, what might entities evolved in radically different environments achieve? Cthulhu's suspended state in drowned Aurelier represents extreme case of documented biological principle, life finding ways to persist through unfavorable epochs, waiting for environmental conditions permitting renewed activity. The stellar alignment requirement, when the stars are right, adds astronomical dimension. Earth's orientation relative to other celestial bodies changes cyclically through axial precession, orbital mechanics, galactic rotation. Certain geometric configurations recur on timescales vastly exceeding human civilization. If Cthulhu requires specific gravitational configurations to break free from Relia, the entity operates according to physical law, not magic. It simply operates on timescales that make human history irrelevant. Waiting millions of years means nothing to something that has already waited for aeons and can wait for aeons more. The elder things from At the Mountains of Madness provide the most scientifically detailed example. These entities arrived on Earth billions of years ago, established civilization, created life forms including humanity's evolutionary ancestors, then declined due to environmental changes and rebellion by their servitor species, the Shoggoths. The narrative presents this as archaeological discovery, complete with murals depicting evolutionary history, architectural analysis, biological specimens preserved in ice. The horror emerges from temporal perspective. Humanity represents accidental byproduct of alien biological experimentation, not intended result. We're leftovers from a failed colonial project, our existence cosmically meaningless even within Earth's own history. This reframes human evolutionary history disturbingly. If the Cambrian explosion, the rapid diversification of life 540 million years ago, resulted from elder thing genetic engineering rather than natural selection alone, then our evolutionary lineage contains deliberate intervention. But the intervention wasn't directed toward producing humanity. We're unintended consequence, evolutionary noise in a larger failed experiment. The elder things didn't create us and wouldn't care about our existence if they still thrived. They're gone. Their civilization collapsed. Their purposes abandoned. We remain only because we proved adaptable enough to survive their departure. These entities collectively embody cosmic horror's philosophical positions through concrete narrative instantiation. Azathoth demonstrates entropy. Yog-Sothoth demonstrates space-time's alien nature. Nyarlathotep demonstrates knowledge as hazard. Cthulhu demonstrates patient, non-human temporality. Elder things demonstrate humanity's derivative status and cosmic belatedness. None violate natural law. All operate according to physical principles, simply on scales and according to biological parameters that render human concerns irrelevant. The question that follows: what happens when humans encounter these entities or forces? How does cosmic horror model the interaction between human consciousness and cosmic reality? The typical Lovecraftian narrative follows a precise trajectory. Skepticism yields to investigation. Investigation yields to discovery. Discovery yields to comprehension. Comprehension yields to madness or death. This pattern isn't dramatic convention. It reflects a specific philosophical claim about the relationship between human neurology and cosmic truth. Our cognitive architecture evolved to solve ancestral problems: predator avoidance, social coalition management, resource acquisition. It did not evolve to comprehend cosmic reality accurately. When confronted with that reality unfiltered, the mind doesn't expand to accommodate new information. It breaks. Consider the progression in The Call of Cthulhu. Francis Thurston begins as rationalist skeptic, dismissing his granduncle's research as academic eccentricity. Investigation reveals disturbing correlations: simultaneous dreams across continents, cult activities on multiple continents worshiping the same entity, independent accounts describing identical imagery. The Norwegian sailor's manuscript provides physical confirmation. Relaye rose temporarily in 1925. Cthulhu emerged briefly before the city sank again, and those who witnessed the event either died immediately or descended into permanent psychological collapse. Thurston synthesizes this evidence, recognizes the pattern, comprehends the implication. The story ends with his acknowledgement that Cthulhu's cult continues growing, that the entity will eventually emerge permanently, and that this knowledge itself may kill him as it killed his granduncle. I know too much, and the cult still lives. The madness function operates as perceptual incompatibility rather than moral corruption. Gothic horror traditionally depicted madness as consequence of sin or moral failure. Vampirism corrupted the soul, demonic possession exploited spiritual weakness. Lovecraftian madness results from sensory input that human neurology cannot process coherently. The color out of space demonstrates this explicitly. The meteor brings a color almost impossible to describe, existing outside the visible spectrum. Those exposed experience progressive deterioration as their neural systems attempt to process perceptual data lacking reference in human experience. The color isn't evil. It's simply incompatible with human sensory architecture. This anticipates neuroscience findings about how perception operates. The brain doesn't passively receive sensory data. It actively constructs models of reality using limited, ambiguous input. Color perception depends on specific photoreceptor cells, cones, sensitive to particular wavelengths. 3 types of cones permit trichromatic vision, allowing us to distinguish millions of colors within a restricted range, roughly 380–750 nanometers. Wavelengths outside that range exist but remain invisible. Ultraviolet, infrared, radio waves, gamma rays. We can detect these using instruments, but we cannot perceive them directly. An entity or phenomenon operating primarily in wavelengths we cannot see would register only through secondary effects, creating the sensation of wrongness without identifiable source. Geometry provides another vector for cognitive collapse. Lovecraft's repeated invocation of non-Euclidean architecture describes structures built according to geometric principles our spatial reasoning rejects. The human visual system evolved to navigate 3-dimensional Euclidean space efficiently. We detect right angles easily, estimate distances accurately within our scale range, process parallel lines as never converging. These assumptions reflect local spatial geometry, but aren't cosmically universal. If gravity significantly warps spacetime, if extra dimensions exist compactified at scales we don't typically observe, if certain regions of space exhibit hyperbolic or elliptic geometry, then structures built according to those principles would violate our geometric intuitions viscerally. The Dunwich Horror's Wilbur Whately represents biological incompatibility. Whately appears superficially human, but possesses anatomy incorporating inhuman elements. His death reveals tentacles, mouths, and other unmentionable features beneath human disguise. His twin brother lacks even superficial humanity, appearing as invisible mass detectable only through the space it occupies and the devastation it causes. The horror emerges from categorical violation, something that appears human but operates according to radically different biological principles. Our neural systems dedicated to facial recognition, human body schema, species identification, all misfire when confronting Whately, producing profound unease prior to any harmful action. Mirror neurons and theory of mind evolved to model other humans, predicting behavior, inferring intentions, facilitating social coordination. These systems assume human-typical neurology, human-typical motivations, human-typical cognitive architecture. Encountering intelligence that lacks these features produces predictable failures. We cannot model Cthulhu's intentions because Cthulhu doesn't have intentions in any human comprehensible sense. We cannot predict Elder Thing behavior because their evolutionary history produced completely different priority structures. The failure isn't moral or spiritual, it's computational, trying to run incompatible software on hardware designed for different purposes. Cultists in Lovecraft's stories demonstrate an alternative response, accepting incomprehensibility and finding meaning through service. The Cthulhu cult, the esoteric order of Dagon, various witch coven congregations, these groups acknowledge cosmic horror's reality and attempt to position themselves advantageously for when it fully manifests. This represents a particular solution to existential terror. If human values and meanings are cosmically meaningless, perhaps adopting alien value systems provides psychological stability. The cultists embrace their own irrelevance, finding purpose in facilitating forces that regard them as insignificant. It's Stockholm Syndrome applied to cosmic scale, identifying with the captor because resistance produces nothing but suffering. Yet this response also leads to deterioration. The Innsmouth residents worshipping Dagon undergo progressive physical transformation, gradually losing human characteristics and gaining Deep One features. Service to cosmic forces requires becoming less human, abandoning the perceptual and cognitive frameworks that constitute humanity. The reward for faithful service is transformation into something that no longer experiences existence through human consciousness. Whether this constitutes salvation or annihilation depends on perspective, and the loss of human perspective eliminates the capacity to evaluate the distinction. The investigators who survive Lovecraftian narratives carry permanent damage. Professor, Angel dies mysteriously after compiling Cthulhu evidence. William Dyer, leader of the Antarctic expedition, begs future explorers to avoid the region he investigated, knowing his warnings will be dismissed as madness. Nathaniel Wingate Peaslee, possessed by great race consciousness in The Shadow Out of Time, spends years reconstructing suppressed memories, finally confirming that his experiences were real, but wishing desperately he'd never pursued verification. Knowledge cannot be unlearned. Once you've recognized the pattern, once you've comprehended the implication, consciousness itself becomes burden. This models a genuine philosophical problem. If cosmic horror is accurate, if the universe genuinely operates according to principles hostile to human meaning-making, what is the psychologically viable response? Denial breaks down upon sufficient evidence. Acceptance produces existential despair. Service requires abandoning humanity. All paths lead to some form of dissolution, either of accurate perception, denial, psychological integrity, despair, or human identity, transformation. The madness function isn't narrative convenience. It's Lovecraft's proposal about what consciousness does when confronted with truths it evolved specifically to avoid recognizing. But what is the nature of this forbidden knowledge that proves so destructive? What specifically destroys those who comprehend it? The Necronomicon functions as Lovecraft's central symbol for knowledge that damages through comprehension. Not a book of spells granting supernatural power, but a text containing information that restructures consciousness in ways incompatible with continued human functioning. Abdul Alhazred, its supposed author, went mad before his death, devoured by invisible monsters in broad daylight, according to the fictional history. Every subsequent reader either dies, descends into insanity, or becomes so altered by comprehension that they cease qualifying as fully human. The book's contents aren't simply disturbing facts. They constitute cognitive hazards, information that acts as virus to human consciousness. This concept of info-hazard, data dangerous merely through being known, has gained traction in contemporary philosophy and computer science. Certain information theoretically poses risks purely through comprehension, independent of any action taken based on that information. Nuclear weapon designs represent practical info hazards. Knowing the critical mass calculations doesn't directly harm you, but that knowledge enables creation of weapons. Lovecraft proposed something more fundamental, knowledge that harms directly, bypassing any intermediate action. The Necronomicon damages readers not because they use its contents unwisely, but because comprehending its contents alters neural architecture in destructive ways. Consider what the Necronomicon supposedly contains, based on references across multiple stories, astronomical data about stellar configurations that permit dimensional barriers to weaken, biological information about species predating humanity, historical accounts of civilizations that rose and fell before humans evolved, incantations described as mathematical formulas rather than mystical phrases, precise phonetic sequences that produce physical effects through principles humanity doesn't yet understand, geographic coordinates of locations where reality structure is fundamentally unstable. The common thread, information revealing that human existence occupies a tiny, precarious space within much larger, indifferent systems. Why would this knowledge prove destructive? The human brain maintains psychological stability through various protective mechanisms. The fundamental attribution error protects self-esteem. Optimism, bias permits long-term planning despite mortality. The just world hypothesis provides sense of control. These aren't bugs in cognition. They're features, adaptations that facilitated survival by preventing accurate perception of our cosmic situation from producing paralytic despair. We evolved to overestimate our importance, to believe our actions matter, to maintain narrative self that persists through time. These useful fictions permit continued functioning. The Necronomicon systematically demolishes these protective mechanisms. Reading astronomical sections reveals Earth's insignificance and humanity's temporal ephemerality. No fundamental attribution error can survive mathematical proof of irrelevance. The biological sections demonstrate that humanity results from random evolutionary processes influenced by alien experimentation. Optimism bias cannot persist when your species' origin is revealed as accident. The historical section shows civilizations vastly more advanced than ours collapsed into extinction, leaving barely traces. Just world hypothesis collapses when the universe demonstrably doesn't care whether advanced civilizations survive or perish. Lovecraft's The Haunter of the Dark introduces the shining trapezohedron, an artifact that permits vision across space and time when properly used. Robert Blake, investigating the artifact, gains access to perspectives across cosmic history, witnessing alien civilizations, perceiving Earth from perspectives separated by millions of years, glimpsing entities existing in dimensions beyond human perception. The experience destroys him, not because he sees something morally evil, but because his consciousness expands to scales it cannot integrate, processing sensory data from viewpoints utterly incompatible with human embodied perspective. He sees too much from too many angles, across too much time. The unified self dissolves under informational overload. Mathematics provides particularly insidious vector for forbidden knowledge. The Dreams in the Witch House features Walter Gilman, a mathematics student at Miskatonic University, who discovers that certain geometric and calculus-based approaches permit consciousness to navigate higher dimensions physically. His studies reveal that three-dimensional space represents a cross-section of higher dimensional reality, that moving through those dimensions requires mathematics most human minds cannot safely process. Attempting to comprehend these calculations drives Gilman progressively mad. not because the math is incorrect, but because human neurology didn't evolve to model four-dimensional or higher spaces accurately. The mathematical truth exceeds cognitive capacity. This reflects genuine cognitive science findings. Human spatial reasoning evolved for three-dimensional Euclidean environments. We can manipulate three-dimensional objects mentally with relative ease, imagining rotation, estimating how shapes fit together, navigating complex spaces. Extending this to four dimensions produces immediate difficulty. Mathematicians work with four-dimensional objects using equations rather than visualization, because visualization fails. Our occipital and parietal cortex regions handling spatial reasoning simply lack the architecture for processing four-dimensional space directly. Attempting to force that processing might genuinely produce neural stress, analogous to running software on hardware lacking necessary components. The recursive nature of forbidden knowledge creates particular horror. Once you've begun reading the Necronomicon, subsequent investigation becomes compulsive. The text references other sources, the Pinacotic manuscripts, De Vermis Mysteries, inscriptions in relief, each promising additional context that might make previous revelations comprehensible. But additional context only reveals further depths of cosmic horror, requiring still more investigation. The pattern mirrors addictive behavior. Each dose of information produces temporary reduction in anxiety, questions answered, followed by greater anxiety, new questions revealed. Compelling continued seeking. Eventually, the investigator knows too much to function normally, but not enough to achieve complete understanding, trapped in epistemic limbo that permits neither ignorance's comfort nor knowledge's closure. The Shadow Out of Time explores this through Nathaniel Peasley's experience. His consciousness is temporarily displaced by an entity from the great race of Yith, species capable of projecting minds across time. When Peasley regains his body years later, he retains fragmentary memories of his time experiencing Yithian civilization, witnessing Earth from perspectives millions of years separated, observing humanity's eventual extinction and replacement by beetle-like successors, comprehending that consciousness is transferable across bodies and epochs. He spends years attempting to dismiss these memories as delusion. When archaeological evidence finally confirms their validity, he experiences not relief, but horror. Delusion would have been preferable. Confirmation means he genuinely knows humanity's fate, knows consciousness is far stranger than human embodiment suggests, knows his identity as Nathaniel Peasley is provisional arrangement rather than fundamental reality. The epistemic collapse occurs when no framework remains for organizing experience coherently. Human cognition requires categories: self, other, real, imaginary, past, present, future, living, dead, natural, supernatural. Lovecraftian knowledge systematically violates all these categories. Entities are neither living nor dead, but suspended between states. Time is neither linear nor cyclical, but exists simultaneously across aeons. The self is neither unified nor permanent, but distributed across multiple substrates. Reality is neither objective nor subjective, but observer-dependent in ways quantum mechanics barely hints at. When all organizing categories fail simultaneously, cognition itself becomes impossible. What remains might be technically conscious, but cannot function as human mind. This philosophical position finds unexpected support in modern physics and neuroscience. Quantum mechanics demonstrates that observation affects reality in ways we still struggle to interpret. Neuroscience reveals that the unified self is convincing illusion constructed from multiple competing subsystems. Cosmology shows that 95% of the universe consists of dark matter and dark energy, whose nature remains fundamentally unknown. The more we learn about reality at scales removed from human perception, the stranger it becomes. Lovecraft proposed that complete understanding of this strangeness would destroy human consciousness. The question becomes, was he wrong? We've examined the philosophical principles, the entities embodying them, the human response to encountering them, and the nature of knowledge that proves toxic to comprehension. These abstract elements required concrete literary instantiation. How did Lovecraft deploy these concepts through actual narrative structures? Which specific stories demonstrate cosmic horror's principles most effectively? Lovecraft's cosmic horror emerged gradually across multiple stories, each contribution building on previous elements while introducing new dimensions. Dagon, 1917, established the foundational template. Isolated narrator encountering evidence of entities vastly predating human civilization, experiencing psychological collapse, documenting the encounter while anticipating doom. The story's narrator, a merchant marine officer, discovers a risen section of ocean floor during World War I, finding a massive stone monolith carved with bas-reliefs depicting some cyclopean city of no architecture known to man or to human imagination. A creature emerges, vast, Polyphemus-like, and loathsome, that the narrator identifies tentatively as Dagon, though the biblical reference serves only as inadequate approximation for something genuinely alien. The encounter drives him to morphine addiction and eventual suicide, documented in the narrative we read as his final testimony. This story established several recurring patterns. The narrator is educated, rational, skeptical. His testimony carries weight because he's not predisposed to fantastic interpretation. The entity appears in connection with geological upheaval, suggesting vast temporal scales and patience exceeding human comprehension. The carving depicts civilizations implying organized non-human intelligence, not mere monsters. The narrator's response isn't heroic resistance, but psychological disintegration. Comprehension itself proves destructive. Finally, the narrative frame positions the text as evidence, documentation left behind by someone who cannot continue existing with what they've learned. Every subsequent major Lovecraft story employs variations on these elements. The Call of Cthulhu, 1928, expanded the scope from individual encounter to global pattern recognition. Francis Thurston inherits documents from his grand-uncle, Professor George, Angel of Brown University, who died mysteriously in 1926. The papers reveal three seemingly unconnected threads: sculptor Henry Wilcox's fevered dreams of cyclopean cities of Titan blocks and sky-flung monoliths, beginning March 1st, 1925. Inspector Legrasse's 1907 raid on Louisiana swamp cult, worshipping something called Cthulhu. Norwegian sailor Gustaf Johansen's account of encountering a risen city in the South Pacific during late March 1925, correlating precisely with Wilcox's dream period. Thurston synthesizes these accounts, recognizing that Cthulhu's temporary awakening caused simultaneous psychic disturbance worldwide, affecting sensitive individuals through dreams while manifesting physically at R'lyeh's coordinates. The story's structure demonstrates Lovecraft developing more sophisticated narrative architecture. Where Dagon presented single testimony, Cthulhu assembles multiple independent sources whose correlation proves the pattern's reality. Wilcox dreams of cities and entities he's never encountered in waking life. Legrasse discovers cult with identical imagery, thousands of miles from Wilcox's location. Johansen provides physical confirmation at precise coordinates and timing matching the dream period. No individual account proves anything definitively. Wilcox might be mentally ill. Legrasse's cult could be coincidence. Johansen's manuscript could be forgery. Together, they create evidential network too consistent to dismiss. The Color Out of Space, 1927, introduced horror predicated not on vast entities, but on incomprehensible phenomenon. A meteorite crashes on the Gardner farm near Arkham in 1882, containing samples of matter that don't match any known elements. Analysis reveals peculiar qualities. The specimens glow with a color almost impossible to describe and seem to exhibit behavior suggesting minimal consciousness or vitality. Over subsequent years, the Gardner property deteriorates progressively. Vegetation grows to abnormal. Sizes then becomes brittle and tasteless. Animals develop bizarre deformities and behavioral changes. The family members experience mental degradation, physical transformation, eventual dissolution into the color itself. The phenomenon spreads gradually through groundwater, leaving the area permanently blasted and sterile, avoided by locals who cannot articulate precisely what makes the region so deeply wrong. This story demonstrated that cosmic horror didn't require entity worship or ancient civilizations. A phenomenon utterly alien to Earth's chemistry and biology, operating according to principles human science cannot categorize, proves equally horrifying through sheer incompatibility. The color represents something our perceptual systems lack, reference to process, a sensory experience outside the range our neurology evolved to handle. The progressive contamination shows reality itself being rewritten according to alien principles, transforming local physics and chemistry in ways that destroy carbon-based life not through hostility, but through fundamental incompatibility. At the Mountains of Madness, 1936, provided Lovecraft's most extensive development of cosmic horror's temporal and biological implications. The Miskatonic University Antarctic Expedition of 1930-1931 discovers fossils and architectural remains of a civilization predating all known life on Earth. The elder things arrived from space during the Precambrian era, established cities, created life forms through biological engineering, including early ancestors of terrestrial life, and eventually declined due to climate changes and rebellion by their servitor species, the Shoggoths. The expedition's findings rewrite evolutionary history entirely. Humanity descends from organisms created as elder thing livestock or laboratory specimens, our existence accidental rather than purposeful, even within Earth's own biological history. The novella's structure mimics scientific expedition report, complete, with detailed descriptions of architectural features, fossil analysis, geological surveys, and recovered murals depicting millions of years of history. This documentary approach lends verisimilitude while enabling Lovecraft to explore implications systematically. If the elder things arrived billions of years ago and humans emerged only recently, our entire civilizational history occupies perhaps 1/1,000,000th of Earth's inhabited period. If they created our evolutionary ancestors as subordinate species for utilitarian purposes, then human consciousness itself derives from alien experimentation. If their advanced civilization collapsed despite technological sophistication far exceeding ours, then our current dominance is temporary aberration, not culmination of progressive development. These stories and others, The Dunwich Horror, 1929, The Shadow over Innsmouth, 1936, The Whisperer in Darkness, 1931, created intertextual network through repeated references. Multiple, Stories mention the Necronomicon, establishing it as consistent source. Miskatonic University appears across narratives, suggesting institutional continuity in investigating these phenomena. Geographic locations recur: Arkham, Innsmouth, Dunwich, creating a New England region where cosmic horror manifests with peculiar frequency. Entity names cross stories, with Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, and Nyarlathotep referenced in multiple texts by different characters who couldn't have coordinated testimony. This network effect transformed isolated weird tales into something resembling suppressed history. Readers encountering multiple stories featuring the same forbidden texts, the same geographic locations, the same entity names began treating these elements as potentially referencing actual phenomena rather than acknowledged fiction. The boundary between Lovecraft's invented mythology and actual occult tradition became productively ambiguous, especially for readers encountering the stories without biographical context about their author. This ambiguity wasn't accidental. It represented deliberate strategy for making cosmic horror feel less like fantasy and more like revelation of suppressed truth. Having established this foundation, we can examine specific stories in detail, analyzing how narrative structure, imagery, and philosophical implication combine to create genuinely disturbing literature that transcends mere entertainment. Two stories deserve particular attention for their effectiveness in encoding cosmic horror's core principles. The Call of Cthulhu functions as Lovecraft's most influential work precisely because its structure enacts the epistemological process cosmic horror describes. The story isn't about encountering Cthulhu directly. The entity appears only briefly, and even then through secondhand account. Instead, it's about pattern recognition across disparate evidence, the gradual realization that scattered phenomena connect into something vastly more disturbing than any individual incident suggests. This mirrors how actual paradigm shifts occur. Anomalous data accumulates until someone perceives the underlying pattern that explains everything while demolishing previous frameworks. The opening paragraph contains Lovecraft's most frequently quoted passage. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little. But someday, the piecing together of dissociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new, dark age. This thesis statement establishes cosmic horror's fundamental claim. Ignorance protects us, knowledge destroys us, and scientific progress moves inevitably toward destructive revelation. The placid island metaphor captures humanity's situation precisely. We occupy a small region of comprehensibility. Human-scale phenomena, familiar physics, manageable complexity, surrounded by vast incomprehensibility. The metaphor's force derives from islands' vulnerability. Rising tides submerge them. Erosion gradually reduces them. They exist only temporarily within larger oceanic systems. Our ignorance island shrinks with each scientific discovery, each correlation of previously dissociated knowledge, each expansion of human understanding into domains we're cognitively unprepared to process. The narrative structure implements this through 3 distinct episodes, each providing independent evidence that gains meaning only through synthesis. Part 1, The Horror in Clay, describes sculptor Henry Anthony Wilcox's fever dreams beginning March 1st, 1925. Wilcox, described as a precocious youth of known genius but great eccentricity, experiences vivid nightmares of great cyclopean cities of Titan blocks and sky-flung monoliths, all dripping with green ooze and sinister with latent horror. He sculpts a bas-relief depicting a creature of a somewhat bloated corpulency with an octopus-like head whose face was a mass of feelers, a scaly, rubbery-looking body, prodigious claws on hind and forefeet, and long, narrow wings behind. Professor Angel, investigating, discovers that sensitive individuals worldwide experienced similar dreams during the same period, suggesting psychic disturbance of global scope. Part 2, The Tale of Inspector Legrasse, jumps backward to November 1907, when New Orleans police raided a swamp cult engaged in ritual activities. Legrasse brought a small idol to an archaeological society meeting, seeking identification. The idol matched Wilcox's sculpture exactly. Same tentacled entity, same hieroglyphic inscriptions, same general proportions, despite being carved 18 years earlier by Louisiana cultists who could have had no contact with Wilcox. The cultists, when interrogated, claimed to worship Great Cthulhu, who had come to the young world out of the sky and now lay dead but dreaming in the great stone city R'lyeh, waiting for the time when the stars were right to rise again and reclaim Earth. This correlation disturbs because it eliminates coincidence as explanation. Wilcox and the Louisiana cult separated by 18 years, hundreds of miles, and complete lack of communication produce identical imagery. Either both accessed the same source independently, suggesting that source is objective reality, or human consciousness contains templates that spontaneously generate specific entity forms under certain conditions, suggesting those templates encode something real about cosmic structure. Neither explanation provides comfort. Part 3. The Madness from the Sea delivers physical confirmation. Thurston discovers a 1925 newspaper account of the ship Emma being attacked by the crew of the Yacht Alert near 47° 9', 126° 43' in the South Pacific, coordinates placing the incident near the location cultists identified as R. Laya. Gustav Johansson's manuscript, written before his mysterious death, describes the Alert crew discovering an uncharted island that had recently risen from the ocean floor, featuring architecture of cyclopean proportions, built according to abnormal, non-Euclidean geometry. The crew investigated, found a great door which they opened, releasing Cthulhu itself. A mountain walked or stumbled. Johansson's description emphasizes scale and wrongness rather than specific features. It lumbered slobberingly into sight and gropingly squeezed its gelatinous green immensity through the black doorway. The thing cannot be described. There is no language for such abysms of shrieking and immemorial lunacy, such eldritch contradictions of all matter, force, and cosmic order. The entity pursues the fleeing sailors, killing most. Johansson rams it with the Alert, causing Cthulhu's head to explode in a sticky noise as of a bursting pod of viscid putrescence. But the entity immediately reconstitutes, reforming from its own scattered substance. Only R'lyeh's resubmersion, occurring through geological processes beyond human influence, saves the survivors. The story's horror emerges from implications rather than events. Cthulhu's temporary awakening in 1925 caused worldwide psychic disturbance, manifesting in sensitive individuals as dreams and in cult activity as intensified worship. The awakening correlated with geological event, tectonic movement raising relief briefly above water, suggesting the entity responds to physical conditions, not supernatural forces. Its ability to reform after physical destruction indicates biology, or physics, fundamentally different from terrestrial life, not cellular structure that suffers permanent damage, but perhaps something closer to non-Newtonian fluid or quantum field achieving temporary coherence. The "when the stars are right" condition implies astronomical alignment, permitting either permanent geological change, Aurelia remaining above water, or dimensional barrier weakening, allowing Cthulhu full manifestation regardless of location. Most disturbing, Cthulhu's cult continues operating globally, growing stronger as astronomical conditions approach optimal alignment. The entity demonstrated in 1925 that it can awaken temporarily, even before ideal conditions arrive. When those conditions do arrive, through inexorable orbital mechanics and stellar positions humanity cannot influence, Cthulhu will rise permanently. All the story's evidence points toward this conclusion, and nothing in the evidence suggests humanity possesses any capacity to prevent it. Thurston ends his narrative with resignation. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. I know too much, and the cult still lives. He has achieved what the opening paragraph warned against: correlation of dissociated knowledge, revealing terrifying vistas of reality and humanity's frightful position therein. The expected result, madness or flight into new dark age, appears imminent. His uncle died mysteriously after compiling this evidence. Thurston himself, having continued the investigation, anticipates similar fate. The story thus enacts its own thesis. Each piece of evidence, dreams, cult activities, physical encounter, appears individually manageable, explainable through psychology, anthropology, or maritime accident. Correlating them reveals pattern that cannot be dismissed, pattern suggesting cosmic horror's reality. The reader experiences this realization alongside Thurston, moving from skepticism through accumulating evidence toward disturbed acceptance. By the story's end, you've either dismissed it as effective fiction or found yourself checking whether those South Pacific coordinates correspond to real ocean floor topography, whether seismic activity occurred in March 1925, whether the correlation might be more than narrative convenience. At the Mountains of Madness represents Lovecraft's most ambitious narrative undertaking, a novella-length expedition report that systematically demolishes anthropocentric assumptions about Earth's biological history. Published serially in Astounding Stories across February, March, and April 1936, the work adopts scientific documentation style to lend verisimilitude while exploring implications far more disturbing than tentacled monsters: humanity as evolutionary afterthought, consciousness as derivative phenomenon, civilizational achievement as repetition of patterns established millions of years prior. The frame narrative establishes credibility through institutional authority. Professor William Dyer of Miskatonic University's Geology Department recounts the 1930-1931 Antarctic expedition he led, writing in 1932 to prevent future expeditions from investigating the regions his team explored. His intended audience is the Starkweather Moore expedition planning further Antarctic penetration, and his purpose is explicitly dissuasive. Some knowledge should remain undiscovered. Some regions should stay unexplored, because what lies there demolishes human self-understanding so thoroughly that learning it serves no beneficial purpose. The expedition discovers a mountain range exceeding the Himalayas in height, previously unknown due to its location in unexplored Antarctic interior. Initial excitement at geographical discovery yields to profound disturbance when the advance camp, led by Professor Lake, reports finding fossils of entirely unknown life forms preserved in remarkable condition. Lake's radio transmissions describe organisms radically unlike any recorded form, with astonishing cellular structure and evidence of deliberate artificial shaping in some specimens. Before Dyer's main party can reach Lake's camp, radio contact ceases. Upon arrival, Dyer finds the camp destroyed, most personnel dead in grotesque circumstances, several members and all the Elder Thing specimens missing. The specimens Lake described possess barrel-shaped bodies, approximately 8 feet tall, 5-fold radial symmetry, starfish-like heads with flexible appendages, leathery wings, multiple eyes arranged around the apex, and organs of unknown function. Crucially, they show evidence of technological sophistication, tool marks on certain body areas suggesting surgical modification, remnants of worked materials in association with the fossils, architectural fragments indicating construction capabilities. These weren't primitive organisms. They represented advanced civilization that flourished when Earth's continents still joined in Pangaea. Dyer and graduate student Danforth continue investigation despite Lake's fate, discovering the vast Elder Thing city built into the mountains themselves. The architecture demonstrates engineering principles unknown to human civilization. Massive blocks fitted without mortar, ventilation systems still partially functional after millions of years, decorative elements suggesting aesthetic sensibilities entirely alien yet somehow comprehensible. Most significantly, they find extensive murals depicting the Elder Thing's history, readable through pictographic clarity that transcends language barriers. The murals reveal a history spanning hundreds of millions of years. The Elder Things arrived on Earth during the Precambrian period, established colonies, created various life forms through biological engineering to serve specific functions. They built cities worldwide, terraformed environments to suit their requirements, achieved technological sophistication that humanity has not yet matched. The murals show them creating the Shoggoths, massive protoplasmic entities, capable of assuming any form, tremendously strong, initially mindless, but progressively developing rudimentary consciousness. Over millions of years, the Shoggoths evolved genuine intelligence, ultimately rebelling against their creators in a war that decimated Elder Thing civilization. Additional enemies emerged. The murals depict conflicts with Cthulhu's spawn arriving from the stars, with formless polyp creatures invading from beneath Earth's surface, with megafungoid entities colonizing Earth's polar regions. The Elder Things fought cosmic wars while their created slaves gained independence, while their civilization gradually collapsed under multiple pressures. By the time humanity's evolutionary ancestors appeared, Elder Thing civilization had retreated to Antarctic Redoubt, maintaining only vestigial presence while Earth's surface came under dominion of species they had not created and could not control. The horror of belatedness operates on multiple levels. First, humanity didn't evolve through purely natural selection. Our distant ancestors resulted from Elder Thing experimentation, biological engineering projects whose intended purposes we cannot reconstruct. We exist because alien scientists created livestock or laboratory specimens millions of years ago, not because cosmic forces designed human consciousness as universe's pinnacle. Second, everything we consider achievements of human civilization, cities, technology, art, science, merely recapitulates patterns the Elder Things established eons before our species existed. We aren't discovering new principles, but stumbling across fragments of knowledge that ancient civilizations treated as elementary. Third, and perhaps most disturbing, the elder things themselves. Despite technological advancement vastly exceeding humanity's, despite geological timescales of civilizational duration, despite mastery of biological engineering and architectural achievement, ultimately failed. Their civilization collapsed. Their created servitors overthrew them. Their cities fell to ruin. Their knowledge was lost. Their species faced extinction or reduction to isolated remnants. If entities that sophisticated, that long-lived, that powerful, could not sustain themselves against entropic forces and hostile competitors, what chance does humanity have? We're repeating a cycle that's played out before, achieving heights that previous species already reached before declining into extinction or irrelevance. Lovecraft emphasizes this through Dyer's growing sympathy for the elder things as the murals reveal their history. Initially regarded as horrifying aliens, they gradually emerge as comprehensible beings facing challenges analogous to those threatening humanity. Environmental changes requiring adaptation, created entities achieving independence and becoming threats, wars of survival against incomprehensible enemies, the slow erosion of civilizational capacity under accumulated pressures. Dyer recognizes them as predecessors rather than others. Following trajectories, humanity may be doomed to repeat. When he discovers relatively recent Elder Thing corpses showing evidence of Shoggoth attack, he feels very sorry for these entities. Acknowledging common cause across millions of years, intelligent beings struggling against hostile universe, achieving temporary success, ultimately failing. The novella's climax involves encountering a living Shoggoth, one of the protoplasmic servitors that has survived in Antarctic caverns. Lovecraft describes it as a terrible, indescribable thing, vaster than any subway train, a shapeless congeries of protoplasmic bubbles, faintly self-luminous, and with myriads of temporary eyes forming and unforming as pustules of greenish light. The entity demonstrates the terrifying success of the Elder Thing's biological engineering, nearly indestructible, infinitely adaptable, having achieved consciousness and independence while retaining the massive size and strength for which it was designed. The Shoggoths represent biotechnology achieving its goals too successfully, created beings surpassing their creators, the inevitable result of designing entities for strength and adaptability. They adapt beyond control. Dyer and Danforth flee, escaping only through fortunate circumstances and the Shoggoth's apparent lack of interest in sustained pursuit. But Danforth looks back during the flight, seeing something beyond the mountains that Dyer never witnesses, and Danforth refuses to describe fully, only muttering, "Tekeli-li, Tekeli-li," the cry associated with the Elder Things throughout the murals. Whatever lies beyond those mountains disturbs Danforth so profoundly that he suffers permanent psychological damage, suggesting horrors exceeding even the Shoggoth encounter. The narrative ends with Dyer's plea to prevent future expeditions. He argues that humanity gains nothing from discovering our evolutionary origins as alien experiments, from learning that civilizational achievement merely echoes patterns millions of years old, from encountering entities like the Shoggoths that regard us as we regard insects. The knowledge serves no beneficial purpose. It provides no technological advantage we couldn't develop independently. It offers only existential horror, the revelation that we're derivative, late arriving, cosmically insignificant, even within Earth's own history. This story demonstrates cosmic horror's philosophical apparatus deployed at maximum ambition. Where the call of Cthulhu suggested entities waiting to reclaim Earth, At the Mountains of Madness reveals Earth was never ours to begin with. We arrived late to a planet already shaped by alien civilizations, inheriting a biosphere engineered by entities whose purposes we cannot reconstruct, following developmental trajectories that previous species traversed more successfully before collapsing anyway. The story strips away every comforting assumption: special creation, evolutionary uniqueness, civilizational novelty, progressive development. What remains is a species accidentally resulting from abandoned experiments, achieving modest success through good fortune, facing inevitable decline because the pattern repeats across geological time. These two stories, The Call of Cthulhu and At the Mountains of Madness, represent cosmic horror's narrative apex, demonstrating how philosophical positions translate into genuinely disturbing fiction through careful structure, accumulated detail, and implications that extend far beyond the immediate events described. But Lovecraft didn't work in isolation. How did collaborative development and posthumous expansion affect the cosmic horror framework he established? Lovecraft's systematic encouragement of collaborative world-building created something unprecedented in weird fiction: a shared mythology that multiple authors developed simultaneously, each contribution adding depth while maintaining overall consistency. This wasn't franchise management or editorial oversight, but organic literary collaboration through correspondence and mutual influence. The results profoundly affected cosmic horror's development, though not always in ways that preserved Lovecraft's philosophical core. Robert E. Howard contributed Unaussprechlichen Kulten, Nameless Cults, by Friedrich von Junst, a fictional grimoire rivaling the Necronomicon in forbidden knowledge content. Howard's 1931 story, The Black Stone, described the book's contents: ancient cults worshipping entities predating human civilization, rituals involving human sacrifice and dimensional summoning, von Junst's own death under mysterious circumstances after completing the manuscript in 1839. Lovecraft incorporated Unaussprechlichen Kulten into his own stories, referencing it in The Shadow Out of Time and Out of the Aeons. This cross-pollination meant readers encountering Howard's work found references to Lovecraft's entities, while Lovecraft's stories cited Howard's invented texts, creating textual network suggesting shared source material rather than coordinated fiction. Clark Ashton Smith developed the most extensively detailed editions, particularly the Book of Ibon and the deity Tsathoggua. Smith's stories set in Hyperborea, a pre-human civilization occupying land that would later become Greenland, depicted worship of Tsathoggua, a toad-like entity dwelling in subterranean darkness. Lovecraft enthusiastically incorporated these elements, mentioning Tsathoggua in The Whisperer in Darkness and referencing the Book of Ibon in multiple stories. Smith reciprocated by including Lovecraftian entities in his Hyperborean cycle, creating the impression that both authors drew from consistent mythological framework predating their individual contributions. This collaborative approach had crucial effect. It made the cosmic horror framework feel discovered rather than invented. When 5 different authors independently reference the same forbidden texts, when characters across multiple stories separated by years and authors encounter the same entity, names when geographic locations recur with consistent characteristics, readers faced textual evidence resembling historical record more than acknowledged fiction. The effect intensified because these authors rarely acknowledged collaboration explicitly in the published stories themselves. References appeared naturally within narratives, as genuine historical citations would. Robert Bloch's contribution to this network carried particular metafictional weight. His 1935 story, The Shambler from the Stars, featured a character named Howard Phillips, who investigates forbidden knowledge and dies when summoned entity attacks him. Lovecraft, delighted by this fictional murder of himself, responded with The Haunter of the Dark, 1936, killing off Bloch's author-insert character, Robert Blake. This playful exchange between authors had serious implication. It positioned the authors themselves within the fictional universe, suggesting that Lovecraft, Bloch, Howard, and Smith weren't inventing these cosmic horrors, but documenting them, sometimes at personal cost. August Derleth's posthumous expansions proved far more problematic. After Lovecraft's death in 1937, Derleth became literary executor, publishing Lovecraft's work and writing numerous posthumous collaborations based on fragmentary notes. Crucially, Derleth systematized cosmic horror into coherent theology that directly contradicted Lovecraft's materialist philosophy. He proposed elder gods, benevolent entities opposing the malevolent great old ones, and outer gods, creating cosmic good versus evil dichotomy completely absent from Lovecraft's work. Derleth organized entities into elemental categories. Cthulhu represented water, Hastur air, Nyarlathotep earth, creating neat taxonomic structure that eliminated cosmic horror's fundamental ambiguity and incomprehensibility. This systematization weakened the philosophical foundation considerably. Lovecraft's entities weren't evil, they were indifferent, operating according to non-human values that rendered human concerns irrelevant. Derleth's framework reintroduced moral dimension, suggesting that cosmic forces could be categorized as good or evil, that elder gods protected humanity against great old ones, that the universe contained moral architecture, even if that architecture operated at scales exceeding human comprehension. This represented fundamental misunderstanding of cosmicism's core premise. The universe doesn't care about human flourishing or suffering, contains no entities protecting us, operates according to physical law rather than moral law. Despite this philosophical corruption, Derleth's systematization proved enormously influential in popularizing cosmic horror. The clean taxonomy, clear good versus evil conflict, and suggestion that cosmic forces could be understood and potentially managed made the material more accessible to wider audiences. Derleth's work appeared in Arkham House publications throughout the 1940s, 1960s, becoming many readers' primary exposure to cosmic horror framework. By the time scholars and dedicated Lovecraft readers recognized Derleth's additions as distortions, they had already been incorporated into popular understanding of the Cthulhu mythos, a term Derleth himself coined and Lovecraft never used. Later writers in the 1960s, 1980s faced choice: follow Lovecraft's philosophical materialism or Derleth's systematized mythology. Some, Ramsey Campbell, Thomas Ligotti, Laird Barron, returned to Lovecraft's core principles, creating cosmic horror that emphasized incomprehensibility and indifference. Campbell's work particularly rejected Derleth's framework, presenting entities that defied categorization and universes that contained no protective forces. Ligotti extended Lovecraft's pessimism into explicitly philosophical territory, writing horror that functioned as applied existential nihilism rather than supernatural thriller. Colin Wilson took an entirely different approach in his novels, beginning with The Mind Parasites, 1967. Wilson treated the Cthulhu mythos as genuine occult system, requiring serious esoteric investigation, proposing that Lovecraft had inadvertently accessed real cosmic truths through fiction. Wilson's characters developed psychic abilities to combat mythos entities, reframing cosmic horror as obstacle to be overcome through human potential development, rather than inexorable force-crushing human meaning. This approach completely inverted Lovecraft's premise. Instead of demonstrating humanity's cosmic insignificance, Wilson's work suggested humanity possessed latent powers that could achieve cosmic significance through proper training. The collaborative and posthumous expansions thus created multiple divergent traditions, all claiming descent from Lovecraft's work. One tradition preserved his materialist philosophy, presenting entities and forces that operated according to physical law, while remaining fundamentally incompatible with human flourishing. Another tradition systematized his entities into manageable taxonomy, reintroducing good versus evil, and suggesting cosmic order rather than cosmic indifference. A third tradition treated his fiction as encoded occultism, proposing that he'd accessed genuine esoteric knowledge. These contradictory approaches all drew textual support from Lovecraft's stories, demonstrating how fiction rich in implication permits multiple incompatible interpretations. The most significant effect, cosmic horror escaped Lovecraft's control entirely, becoming larger cultural phenomenon that adapted to various purposes. Game designers used it for role-playing systems. Occultists incorporated it into ritual practice. Philosophers cited it in phenomenology discussions. Musicians drew on it for aesthetic inspiration. Each appropriation emphasized different aspects. Some retained the philosophical core, others extracted surface aesthetics while abandoning underlying cosmicism. By the 21st century, Lovecraftian could designate anything from rigorous philosophical horror to tentacle monster action thriller, with the original philosophical framework often barely recognizable beneath accumulated interpretations. This raises crucial question. How did cosmic horror's transition from literary movement to cultural phenomenon affect its impact? What happens when stories designed to convey philosophical positions become cultural products consumed for entertainment? When fiction warning about forbidden knowledge becomes itself knowledge widely disseminated? The Necronomicon achieved something remarkable for a fictional text. It became more culturally real than many actual historical documents. By the 1960s, university libraries reported regular requests for the book, with librarians forced to explain repeatedly that Abdul al-Hazred never existed, that no manuscript had ever been held by the British Museum or Bibliothèque Nationale, that the entire provenance was Lovecraft's invention. The persistence of these inquiries, despite readily available information, reveals something about how fiction infiltrates cultural consciousness when structured appropriately. The Necronomicon occupied the same psychological space as genuinely lost texts like Aristotle's On Comedy or the complete works of Sappho, books that should exist, that the pattern of cultural knowledge suggests must exist somewhere. Multiple hoax editions capitalized on this ambiguity. The Simon Necronomicon, published by Lovecraft in 1977, combined Lovecraftian elements with Sumerian mythology, presenting itself as translation of ancient Mesopotamian grimoire that had inspired Lovecraft's fiction. The book provided incantations, sigil designs, ritual instructions, functional occult text using Lovecraft's framework as organizational principle. Despite obvious fabrication, mixing incompatible mythological systems, containing anachronistic language, making historically impossible claims, it sold hundreds of thousands of copies and remains in print. occult practitioners incorporated it into actual magical practice, creating feedback loop where fictional grimoire generates real ritual tradition that then cites the grimoire as source authority. The Hay Necronomicon, 1978, and various other versions followed similar strategy, each claiming authenticity through different provenance stories. Some alleged discovery in monastery archives, others claimed inheritance from occult societies. Still others presented themselves as channeled material received psychically. The proliferation created situation where multiple incompatible versions all claimed to be the real Necronomicon, with adherents of each version dismissing others as fraudulent. Precisely the pattern actual religious scripture exhibits across denominational divisions. The fiction had generated schisms. Relier's coordinates provided another vector for reality testing. Lovecraft specified 47-degree nines, 1 in 26-degree 43 W in the Call of Cthulhu, placing the sunken city in the South Pacific, roughly 1,700 kilometers from New Zealand. Amateur researchers began examining bathymetric data of this region, discovering that it lies near Point Nemo, the oceanic point most distant from any landmass, the location where space agencies drop decommissioned spacecraft. The region contains multiple seamounts and undersea volcanic formations, providing plausible geological features that could rise temporarily during seismic activity. In 1997, the bloop, an extremely loud, ultra-low frequency underwater sound detected by NOAA, was recorded from this approximate region. Initial analysis couldn't identify the source, leading to speculation about massive underwater entities. Later analysis attributed the sound to icequake, but the brief window of mystery generated thousands of Cthulhu Awakening articles online. Antarctic mysteries received similar treatment. When researchers drilling through ice to reach Lake Vostok, a subglacial lake isolated for millions of years, expressed concerns about contaminating pristine environment or potentially releasing unknown organisms, internet communities immediately connected this to "at the mountains of madness." The lake's isolation and potential to harbor unique, extremophile life forms mapped perfectly onto Lovecraft's narrative of discovering Elder Thing remnants in Antarctic ice. The actual scientific concerns, invasive species introduction, sample contamination, became conflated with fictional scenarios, awakening ancient entities, releasing Shoggoths. Scientists investigating legitimate extremophile research found themselves receiving questions about whether they feared encountering elder things. Real organizations claiming mythos connections emerged repeatedly. The Esoteric Order of Dagon, which Lovecraft invented for the shadow over Innsmouth, has been established multiple times by actual groups, sometimes as joke organizations, sometimes as serious occult bodies incorporating Lovecraft's entities into magical practice. The line between parody and sincere belief often blurred, with members uncertain whether their co-practitioners approach the material as creative fiction, psychological archetype system, or literal cosmological truth. This uncertainty mirrors religious organizations' own evolution. Cargo cults, modern neo-pagan movements, even mainstream religions often originated as conscious constructions that subsequent generations treated as received tradition. The pattern reveals how fiction becomes folklore when it occupies conceptual space where genuine mysteries reside. We know vast regions of ocean remain unexplored. We know Antarctica conceals features under kilometers of ice that won't be fully mapped for decades. We know that extremophile organisms survive in conditions previously considered impossible for life. These genuine unknowns create psychological space where Lovecraft's fictions settle comfortably, close enough to actual scientific uncertainty that distinguishing complete fabrication from speculative extrapolation requires effort most casual consumers don't invest. The Necronomicon hoaxes succeed because lost texts genuinely exist in fragmentary references. Relie coordinates intrigue because oceanic trenches genuinely hide geological features we haven't surveyed. Antarctic elder things resonate because ice genuinely preserves organisms across geological time. This cultural absorption demonstrates cosmic horror achieving mythological status, stories that function as frameworks for interpreting genuine uncertainties, that provide narrative structure for actual anxieties about what might lurk in unmapped regions. The hoaxes and sightings aren't simply delusion. They represent cognitive pattern matching applying fictional frameworks to real phenomena, testing whether Lovecraft's cosmic horror might explain actual mysteries better than conventional alternatives. How did visual and interactive media adapt cosmic horror's essentially literary and philosophical content? Can film and games convey incomprehensibility, or does visualization inevitably domesticate the unknowable? Film confronts immediate obstacle when attempting cosmic horror. The medium demands visualization, while cosmic horror's effectiveness depends on remaining unvisualized. Lovecraft's entities work through suggestion, through descriptions emphasizing wrongness rather than specific features, through the gap between what characters perceive and what language can articulate. Cinema cannot maintain this gap. Whatever appears on screen becomes definite, bounded, comprehensible through being seen. The tentacled monster, however elaborately designed, registers as special effect rather than incomprehensible cosmic force. This fundamental incompatibility explains why direct Lovecraft adaptations typically fail, while films capturing cosmic horror's atmosphere without literal adaptation often succeed. Stuart Gordon's Reanimator, 1985, and From Beyond, 1986, demonstrate the typical approach. Extract Lovecraft's premise, add graphic violence and body horror, create entertaining splatter films that abandon philosophical substrate entirely. Reanimator takes Lovecraft's Herbert West Reanimator and transforms it into darkly comic gore fest, replacing the story's exploration of consciousness and mortality with increasingly absurd reanimation sequences. The film succeeds as horror comedy, but bears almost no relationship to Lovecraft's materialist philosophy. Similarly, From Beyond visualizes the resonator device and the creatures it reveals, making explicit and visceral what Lovecraft kept suggestive and overwhelming. The result entertains but doesn't disturb in ways cosmic horror intends. We leave having seen monsters, not having glimpsed cosmic indifference. John Carpenter's The Thing, 1982, despite not being Lovecraft adaptation, achieves cosmic horror's effects more successfully than most direct adaptations. The creature's fundamental incomprehensibility, it assimilates and perfectly imitates other organisms, rendering identity itself suspect, creates paranoid uncertainty that visualization somehow enhances rather than diminishes. The practical effects emphasize wrongness, bodies opening in directions they shouldn't, flesh behaving according to non-biological principles, forms that violate categorical boundaries between distinct organisms. Crucially, we never understand what the thing wants, where it originated, or what it fundamentally is. It remains alien despite extensive screen time, operating according to logic we cannot access. Event Horizon, 1997, translated cosmic horror into science fiction framework, proposing that faster-than-light travel requires passing through dimension of pure chaos, effectively hell, though the film leaves ontological status ambiguous. The ship returns from this dimension contaminated, bringing back something that drives crew members mad through visions, transforming the vessel into hostile environment, operating according to non-physical laws. The film's crucial move, refusing to explain what the other dimension contains, or why exposure produces specific effects. The chaos remains genuinely chaotic, incomprehensible rather than merely unexplained. Unfortunately, studio interference trimmed the most disturbing footage, and the film underperformed commercially, demonstrating market resistance to genuine cosmic horror in mainstream cinema. Annihilation, 2018, represents recent attempt to visualize cosmic horror through biological rather than tentacular means. The Shimmer, an expanding zone where DNA refracts and recombines, creates environment where biological laws operate differently, producing hybrid organisms and scrambling human identity at cellular level. Director Alex Garner adapted Jeff Vandermeer's novel by emphasizing visual beauty alongside horror. The zone is gorgeous, alien, fundamentally incompatible with human biology. The ending refuses definitive explanation. We never learn what the Shimmer is, what it wants, whether the protagonist who returns is genuinely herself or sophisticated copy. This ambiguity frustrated audiences expecting resolution, and the film received limited theatrical release, again suggesting that genuine cosmic horror struggles commercially. Gaming as medium proves more compatible with cosmic horror's principles, primarily because interactivity permits structural reinforcement of philosophical positions. Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, first published in 1981, innovated the sanity mechanic. Characters possess sanity points that decrease upon encountering cosmic horrors, with permanent losses potentially causing madness, phobias, or complete psychological collapse. Knowledge itself functions as resource that damages. Learning mythos information grants capabilities but reduces maximum sanity. The game implements cosmic horror's core claim mechanically. Comprehension destroys. Players experience firsthand the trajectory Lovecraft's protagonists follow, watching their characters deteriorate psychologically as investigation proceeds. Bloodborne, 2015, embedded cosmic horror into gameplay structure more subtly. The game initially presents as Victorian Gothic werewolf hunt, but extended play reveals cosmic entities manipulating events, with insight statistic determining what players can perceive. Low insight shows Gothic environment with beasts and hunters. High insight reveals cosmic entities that were always present but imperceptible, rewrites certain encounters entirely, makes visible the amygdalas clinging to cathedral walls throughout the game. This mechanic literalizes the idea that reality contains more than baseline perception reveals, that increased understanding fundamentally changes experienced world. The game punishes insight gain through increased difficulty and frenzy vulnerability, mechanically demonstrating that ignorance protects while knowledge endangers. Darkest Dungeon, 2016, made psychological deterioration central to gameplay. Characters suffer stress alongside health damage, with high stress causing afflictions, paranoia, masochism, hopelessness, or occasionally virtue, stalwart, courageous. The game's gothic horror aesthetic gradually reveals cosmic horror substrate as players progress, encountering entities and phenomena exceeding natural explanation. Crucially, stress persists between expeditions. Traumatized characters carry damage forward, requiring expensive treatment or replacement. The game enforces resource management of human sanity, making explicit that investigators in cosmic horror context are consumable resources, not heroes overcoming challenges. Metal music discovered natural affinity with cosmic horror's themes, with Metallica's instrumental The Call of Cthulhu on 1984, establishing precedent. The track's progressive structure, building from quiet unease to crushing heaviness, mirrors cosmic horror's narrative progression from normalcy to overwhelming revelation. Multiple metal bands subsequently named themselves after Lovecraft entities: Azathoth, Shub-Niggurath, Nyarlathotep, while incorporating cosmic horror themes into lyrics emphasizing humanity's insignificance and universe's fundamental hostility. Dark ambient music proved even more compatible. Artists like Lustmord and labels like Cryo Chamber create extended soundscapes evoking vast empty spaces and incomprehensible presences. These compositions avoid melody, harmony, and rhythm in conventional senses, instead producing sonic environments that suggest cosmic scale and alien indifference. Listening becomes immersive experience of disorientation and scale-related unease, achieving through sound what Lovecraft achieved through prose: the sensation of confronting something too large, too alien, too indifferent to process comfortably. The H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society produced musical comedies, A Shoggoth on the Roof, 2009, and Microfish, or Please Don't Eat the Deep Ones, 2019, that paradoxically honor cosmic horror through parody. By rewriting classic musical theater to incorporate Lovecraft elements, they demonstrate the material's cultural penetration while creating distance through humor. This represents coping mechanism. Making cosmic horror absurd renders it manageable, transforming existential threat into cultural product safely consumed. These adaptations reveal cosmic horror's flexibility and fragility. The philosophical core, cosmic indifference, human insignificance, knowledge as hazard, can survive translation across media when structural elements reinforce theme. But surface-level adaptation, tentacles, arcane tomes, New England settings, easily detaches from philosophical substrate, producing aesthetic cosmic horror, emptied of cosmicism. The question becomes whether this matters. Does cosmic horror require philosophical integrity, or has it evolved into aesthetic category that functions independent of Lovecraft's original intentions? Philosophy departments discovered Lovecraft surprisingly late, given that his work functioned as applied philosophy from inception. Eugene Thacker's In the Dust of This Planet, 2011, catalyzed academic interest by treating cosmic horror as serious philosophical literature, exploring the limits of human comprehension. Thacker introduced the concept of the world without us, reality as it exists independent of human perception or existence, arguing that Lovecraft's fiction attempted to represent precisely this unrepresentable concept. The book became an unexpected bestseller, appearing in popular culture through True Detective, 2014, and achieving rare crossover between academic philosophy and mainstream visibility. Graham Harmon's weird realism extended this approach, arguing that Lovecraft's prose style itself enacted philosophical position. Harmon, a prominent object-oriented ontology philosopher, proposed that Lovecraft's excessive adjectives, eldritch, blasphemous, cyclopean, didn't constitute bad writing, but deliberate strategy for conveying objects that exceed human categorical frameworks. When Lovecraft describes something as simultaneously terrible, ancient, and geometrically wrong, he's attempting to evoke reality independent of human access, the thing in itself that Kantian philosophy declares unknowable. Harmon reads Lovecraft's stylistic peculiarities as philosophical method, prose struggling to represent what prose fundamentally cannot represent. Thomas Ligotti's The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, 2010, deployed cosmic horror philosophy without fictional framing. Ligotti, horror writer and philosophical pessimist, argued that consciousness is catastrophic error, that awareness of our cosmic situation produces suffering without compensating benefit, that the universe would be better had consciousness never evolved. He cited Lovecraft extensively alongside Schopenhauer, Zapffe, and anti-natalist philosophers, treating cosmic horror not as genre fiction, but as accurate description of reality's nature. The book presented Lovecraft's cosmicism as straightforward truth, stripped of narrative protection that fiction provides. These philosophical appropriations legitimized cosmic horror as intellectual tradition worthy of serious analysis. Academic conferences emerged. Lovecraft and Philosophy collections published multiple volumes. University courses treated his work alongside Kant and Nietzsche. Scholarly articles analyzed cosmic horror's relationship to phenomenology, existentialism, and speculative realism. This represented significant elevation from pulp fiction origins, though it risked over-intellectualizing material that derived power partly from disreputable status and lowbrow accessibility. Psychology and neuroscience found different applications. Terror management theory, which proposes that humans develop cultural worldviews to manage anxiety about mortality, treats cosmic horror as thought experiment. What happens to psychological defense mechanisms when confronted with frameworks explicitly denying all consolation? Studies examined why some individuals find Lovecraft therapeutic rather than disturbing, discovering that externalizing existential dread through cosmic horror narratives can provide relief from personal anxieties. If the universe itself is hostile and meaningless, individual failures and disappointments lose significance. This paradoxical comfort, finding solace in cosmic horror's denial of cosmic meaning, suggests the material functions psychologically in unexpected ways. Apophenia research, the tendency to perceive meaningful patterns in random data, used cosmic horror as illustrative example. The Lovecraft protagonist's trajectory mirrors conspiracy theorists. Isolated data points, dreams, cult activities, strange encounters get interpreted as connected pattern revealing hidden truth. The difference: in Lovecraft's fiction, the pattern is real. This raises unsettling question about when pattern recognition becomes pathological. How do we distinguish genuine correlation from delusional connection? Cosmic horror exploits this uncertainty, presenting patterns that could be either profound insight or madness, leaving readers unable to determine which interpretation is correct. Occult communities appropriated cosmic horror most literally. Kenneth Grant's Typhonian Ordo Templi Orientis incorporated Lovecraft's entities into ceremonial magic framework, treating them as genuine extra-dimensional intelligences accessible through ritual. Grant proposed that Lovecraft had psychically contacted actual cosmic forces, translating genuine occult knowledge into fiction form. His magical system included invocations of Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, and Nyarlathotep alongside traditional magical entities, creating syncretic practice combining Thelema, Tantra, and Lovecraftian cosmology. Chaos magic took more pragmatic approach, treating Lovecraft's entities as egregores, thought forms achieving independent existence through collective belief. Chaos magicians argued that ontological status didn't matter. If sufficient people believed in Cthulhu, treated it as real, performed rituals addressing it, then Cthulhu functioned practically as real within magical contexts. This position neatly sidestepped questions about objective existence. The entity works magically, regardless of whether it exists, independent of human belief. Fiction becomes functional reality through sustained collective engagement. Internet culture transformed cosmic horror into participatory framework. The SCP Foundation, collaborative fiction project presenting itself as documentation of anomalous objects and entities requiring containment, explicitly adapted Lovecraft's faux documentary approach for wiki format. Thousands of contributors write SCP files describing reality-warping objects, hostile entities, and incomprehensible phenomena, creating massive database that newcomers often initially mistake for genuine classified documentation. The project succeeds through Lovecraft's technique: bureaucratic documentation style, clinical language, redacted information suggesting deeper secrets, and collaborative consistency, creating impression of institutional reality. Subreddits like r Lovecraft and r Cthulhu Mythos developed interpretive communities debating canonical questions that Lovecraft never resolved. Does Azathoth possess consciousness? What are the outer gods' relationship to physical law? Can humanity develop technology to resist cosmic forces? These debates mirror theological discussions in religious communities, treating fictional framework with scholarly seriousness while acknowledging its fictional status, maintaining productive ambiguity about whether they're interpreting literature or investigating actual cosmology. AI-generated content revealed disturbing pattern. Language models trained on Lovecraft produce text that sounds authentically cosmic horror while being semantically unstable, suggesting connections without coherent meaning, generating the sensation of significance without actual content. This accidentally recreates Lovecraft's technique, language that evokes comprehension just beyond reach. When AI produces eldritch text, it literally demonstrates incomprehensible intelligence, creating output human readers cannot fully parse, performing cosmic horror's central premise through technological means. These varied appropriations demonstrate cosmic horror's escape from literary containment into broader cultural circulation. Philosophy deploys it as thought experiment. Psychology uses it to model existential anxiety. Occultism treats it as legitimate magical system. Internet communities engage it as participatory mythology. Each appropriation emphasizes different aspects: philosophical rigor, psychological function, magical utility, collaborative creativity, suggesting the framework contains sufficient depth to support multiple simultaneous interpretations without exhausting its possibilities. But why does this particular fictional framework achieve such persistent cultural resonance? What underlying features permit cosmic horror to function across such varied contexts while maintaining recognizable identity? Cosmic horror resonates with particular intensity in the contemporary moment because the gap between Lovecraft's speculative philosophy and actual scientific discovery has narrowed considerably. When Lovecraft wrote in the 1920s, 1930s, cosmic insignificance required imaginative effort to grasp. The universe's scale exceeded intuitive comprehension, but most people could avoid confronting that scale in daily life. Today, cosmic imagery saturates culture through Hubble photographs, popular science communication, and accessible astronomy data. We routinely encounter visualizations of galactic superclusters, simulations of cosmic evolution across billions of years, calculations demonstrating our infinitesimal proportion of space and time. Lovecraft's philosophical horror has become ambient cultural knowledge. Climate change functions as slow Cthulhu rising, inevitable catastrophe we comprehend intellectually but feel powerless to prevent. The pattern mirrors cosmic horror precisely, knowledge without capacity for meaningful action, watching inexorable process unfold according to inhuman timescales, geological rather than cosmic, but still exceeding human political and economic cycles. Recognizing that the forces involved dwarf human agency. Rising sea levels literalize our Laia's emergence, with coastal cities facing submersion through processes we initiated but cannot reverse. The psychological experience, knowing catastrophe approaches, understanding the mechanisms, lacking power to stop it, replicates Lovecraft's protagonists watching stellar alignments approach optimal configuration for Cthulhu's awakening. The Fermi paradox generates cosmic horror through its darker resolutions. If the universe should contain abundant intelligent life given its age and scale, yet we observe no evidence of such life, several explanations present themselves. Perhaps intelligence inevitably self-destructs before achieving interstellar presence. Perhaps successful civilizations deliberately hide or remain silent for reasons we don't understand. Perhaps something systematically eliminates technological civilizations before they spread. The dark forest hypothesis, that announcing your presence to the cosmos invites extermination from hostile civilizations, transforms the universe into Lovecraftian landscape where visibility equals death, where intelligent species hide in cosmic darkness, where communication itself constitutes existential risk. Artificial intelligence development parallels humanity's relationship to cosmic forces in disturbing ways. We're creating intelligence that will potentially regard us as we regard insects, recognizing our existence without assigning moral significance to our preferences or survival. The alignment problem, ensuring advanced AI systems share or respect human values, mirrors cosmic horror's fundamental challenge. How do you negotiate with intelligence operating according to completely different value structures? We cannot, just as Lovecraft's protagonists cannot negotiate with entities for whom human existence registers as noise rather than significance. The difference, we're deliberately creating these intelligences, potentially reproducing the Elder Thing's mistake with the Shoggoths, engineering entities that will surpass and ultimately replace us. Quantum mechanics delivers its own cosmic horror through empirical demonstration that reality is fundamentally weird. Particles exist in superposition until observed, with observation itself affecting outcome. Entangled particles maintain correlation across arbitrary distances through mechanisms we don't understand. The measurement problem, why quantum systems appear to collapse to definite states upon observation, remains unresolved, with interpretations ranging from consciousness playing fundamental role in reality to infinite parallel universes splitting at each quantum event. These aren't fringe theories, but mainstream physics, empirically verified, yet philosophically incomprehensible. We've discovered that reality at fundamental level operates according to principles that violate intuitive understanding, that measurement and observation function in ways we cannot reconcile with everyday experience. The multiverse hypothesis extends this disorientation further. If eternal inflation or many worlds interpretation is correct, then infinite universes exist with every possible configuration of physical constants and initial conditions. Our universe, with its apparently fine-tuned parameters permitting life, represents random outcome among infinite variations. We're not special, even within cosmic context. We're statistical inevitability given infinite trials. This validates Lovecraft's central claim. Human existence is accidental. Our universe's apparent design is selection bias. we necessarily find ourselves in a universe compatible with our existence. Cosmic forces operate with complete indifference to whether consciousness emerges or persists. Boltzmann brain problem demonstrates how seriously physics takes cosmic horror scenarios. In infinite universe trending toward maximum entropy, random quantum fluctuations could spontaneously assemble conscious observers, brains materializing from chaos with false memories and perceptions, existing briefly before dissipating. Given infinite time and space, such fluctuations would vastly outnumber evolved observers like humans. Therefore, probabilistically, you're more likely to be a Boltzmann brain experiencing illusory, coherent reality than an actual evolved organism in stable universe. This isn't science fiction. It's logical consequence of accepted cosmological models that physicists actively work to resolve. The universe itself, according to our best theories, might be elaborate illusion experienced by randomly assembled consciousness. Rocco's basilisk represents contemporary info hazard, information dangerous through comprehension. The thought experiment proposes that future superintelligent AI might retroactively punish those who didn't work to bring about its existence, creating incentive to help develop it regardless of whether such development is beneficial. Simply comprehending this argument supposedly creates obligation, making the knowledge itself hazardous. Whether the argument actually works logically is debatable, but the concept that certain ideas damage consciousness through being understood directly instantiates Lovecraft's Necronomicon principle in contemporary philosophical context. These scientific and technological developments confirm cosmic horror's philosophical accuracy in ways Lovecraft couldn't have anticipated. He proposed that universe operates according to principles hostile to human meaning-making, that our cosmic situation is more precarious and insignificant than we wish to acknowledge, that increased knowledge reveals disturbing truths rather than comforting certainties. Physics, cosmology, and emerging technologies have systematically validated these claims. We live in a universe dominated by unknown dark matter and dark energy. We observe cosmic acceleration suggesting eventual heat death. We discover that consciousness emerged accidentally in a tiny region of incomprehensible vastness. We develop technologies that may create intelligences regarding us as irrelevant. The UET psychological response divides predictably. Some embrace absurdism, acknowledging meaninglessness while choosing to create personal meaning anyway. Camus' rejection of both hope and despair. Some retreat into traditional religious frameworks that reassert cosmic purpose and divine attention. Some adopt cosmic horror aesthetics while avoiding philosophical implications, consuming Lovecraft-themed entertainment without genuinely confronting cosmicism's challenges. Some, like Ligotti, accept cosmic horror's accuracy and conclude that consciousness itself was a mistake, that awareness of our situation produces suffering without compensating benefit. But cosmic horror also provides unexpected comfort through radical perspective shift. If universe genuinely doesn't care about human concerns, then human failures lose cosmic significance. Personal disappointments, social anxieties, even species-level catastrophes register as noise in cosmic context. This perspective, sometimes called cosmic pessimism or nihilistic therapy, liberates by demolishing inflated self-importance. You're not special. Your problems aren't cosmically significant. The universe's indifference applies equally to your successes and failures. For certain temperaments, this produces profound relief. The enduring implication: cosmic horror isn't genre fiction that we consume and forget. It's philosophical framework that, once comprehended, cannot be uncomprehended. You cannot unknow that you occupy infinitesimal fraction of cosmic space and time. You cannot unlearn that consciousness emerged accidentally and will eventually cease. You cannot dismiss the evidence that reality at fundamental scales operates according to principles incompatible with human intuition. Lovecraft proposed that certain knowledge destroys psychological stability through simple comprehension. The question is no longer whether he was correct in principle. The question is whether we're already living in the aftermath of that destruction, maintaining functional denial while knowing at some level that cosmic horror accurately describes our situation. If cosmicism is true, if the universe genuinely operates with complete indifference to human meaning, if our existence genuinely constitutes cosmic accident, if knowledge genuinely reveals increasingly disturbing truths, what is the psychologically viable response? And having thought these thoughts, having recognized these patterns, having acknowledged these implications, how exactly do we proceed? The answer, if one exists, remains mercifully unclear.